Hi, Christian Young from Impress Solutions again. How big are the holes in your safety and health management system? Every safety and health management is guaranteed to have some gaps. None is perfect, but I wonder how big are the holes in them? And just because you might comply with legislation or whatever the framework is, doesn't mean that there could be some pretty big issues inside of that. So we recently were helping a client with a review of their SHMS, and our starting point, or one of our inputs, is to look at their broad brush risk assessment and to go through that line by line and say, okay, well, where you've got a critical risk or a fatal risk, or for this organisation, a permanent injury risk, let's go and look at the safety and health management system to see where is this addressed, where is this assigned. And going through that process, unfortunately, there was about 45 line items, or 15% of the line items were not mentioned in the safety and health management system. So they called them out in the risk assessment, said this is an issue, this is generically what we should do to control it, but there was no system control. So it's pretty much just words on the paper. Big issue, a lot of light bulbs came on for this organisation, and pretty quickly there was some work performed to close out those gaps. And that was just a simple review there. And oftentimes, one of the things we see, and I wonder if your organisation might have this, and I work in the mining industry, and I know many of these people, that they can quote you verbatim on the legislation, because it's a very legislation-based framework that organisations use for their SHMS. But if you ask them, well, tell me about what are the critical risks and what are the critical controls that should also be in the safety and health management system, there's crickets. And so it shows that if we're just being enshrined or attached to legislation, we're potentially missing some other key information that should go into our SHMS. And this is a very simple model that we use when we talk to some of our clients to help paint this picture. So think about a very simple injury triangle where we've got multiple fatalities at the top, all the way through down to reversible injuries down the bottom. And represented as a triangle because hopefully we just have less at the top. Well, we don't want any, but less at the top relative to the bottom. And then we also have whatever the framework is that you or your organisation uses to design your safety and health management system. So if some organisations use the ISO standard for safety, so 45001, we know some mining houses do that. Some might use legislation, some might use an internal structure, it doesn't really matter. But there's some type of framework there. And oftentimes we see that there isn't a very good relationship between all of the risks that have been identified and the legislation or the framework there. So a classic example that we use sometimes when we think about it from a risk-based perspective is the risk of people driving offsite, offsite vehicle driving, which could potentially have multiple fatality. That doesn't naturally live inside the framework or a legislation framework. And so how is that addressed? Another example could be toxic and irrespirable atmospheres, which are not associated with a confined space. It could be a risk, but how is that addressed inside the framework? And that's the question that we ask a lot of our clients when we do our work is, well, let's go through a process to identify these things. And if they're identified, well, what can we do about them? And there's at least two things that we like to do. So one is thinking about how can we align our risks and our SHMS document types, because all of us have some document types. So same triangle again that we've talked about, and we then either use the organisation's structure or our starting point from a generic structure where we can see, okay, for any of these critical risks, what the organisation calls critical, we would expect to see a certain type of risk document, a certain type of procedural document, and there'd be some type of relationship between the risk and the SHMS document. I'm not going to run through all of these, but let's say, for example, if there was a critical risk, let's say underground fire, we'd expect to see then a bespoke risk assessment on underground fire. We'd expect to see a bespoke management plan to underground fire, and there'd be a one-to-one relationship on that. So we think back to that broad brush risk assessment example. If they had 50 risks, then we'd be looking through this framework to see, well, just in your general architecture, how have you got these addressed? So we can take that base view. So that's a risk-based view. And then the other lens that we can use is to take an activity-based approach. So what are all the tasks and activities that we do, and how does that flow into the safety and health management system? And so one of the ways to move through that is a mapping activity or a mapping exercise, where we take at a higher level our organisational functions or our key processes, and we start to go down, 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 let's say to level 3. So ultimately where we get to a level where we can say, okay, for example, here in workshop maintenance electrical, we do these 4 activities. And we say, okay, that's great. Let's now look at the SHMS and show and map these into, well, where are the hazards associated with these activities identified, and where is it talked about how they're managed. And so that starts to give us a interesting lens as well on the safety and health management system. So again, this isn't using legislation or the ISO standard. It's not using risks. It's using the view of, well, what do you actually do here, and where is it addressed inside the safety and health management system? So rounding this out, to help you ensure you don't have holes, or you're not quite sure if you've got holes, there's at least 2 things you can do, which is aligning the risks to your SHMS document types, doing the mapping of the activities against you. And if you think you need help or you need a tool for that, then we have a pretty simplified tool that we use when we go through and help our organisations around safety and health management systems, which allows us to see whatever the framework is they use on the left, and we're literally moving left to right to then map this against risks, document types, critical controls, critical risks, any other internal or external requirements, so we can see it all together in the one line and give a health check. So that's it. Interesting discussion around SHMS. Always interested in people's thoughts in this. Have a great day. Bye-bye.